Hello and welcome to Sides of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History graduate students. My name is Jacob Glicklick, and I'll be the producer of the show. The things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Sides of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and quotations in no way represent River West Radio. They are solely the views of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is therefore not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So again, thanks for tuning in and catching this either live or in the archive. This will be an episode of Sides of Thoughts. So my guest tonight, first-time guest, is Monique Liston.
Hi, so happy to be here.
Yeah, very happy to have you here. So this is the first time having Monique within the show, but had met previously last year in February when Alliance History graduate students organized a labor conference, and I was panel chair for the panel that capitalist pedagogy and its discontents, where it was with Monique, with then graduate student Milwaukee Louis Mercer, and Eli as well from friends, which at that point talked about the school-to-prison pipeline and impact of systemic racism in just structuring the whole way that most people experienced education. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's I guess one of the things to be interested in asking further about. Although I understand that research goes sort of beyond that, and that it also other things, in the context of like some of the recent discussions have had on Black Panther Party and long-term impact. So I don't know. I guess opening of it. I mean, in looking at like dissertation as a whole. I mean, if giving the elevator pitch version of what you're studying, what would that be?
You get that question all the time, and then you start talking. You realize you're talking for hours because
long elevator ride, presumably.
Because it is your dissertation. Right now, I am researching African-centered education as it plays out in the United States. And so what we're finding is, or what I'm finding in my research in particular, is that there's a lot of research on the theoretical frameworks surrounding African-centered education, about its pedagogy, about its philosophy, about its theory, but very few empirical studies about either the schools, effectiveness, efficacy, student achievement, student success, all of those things that actually impact what happens in the school. And so my contribution to that large gap in the literature is really looking at African-centered education as it's played out in Milwaukee over the last 20 years. Milwaukee has a unique relationship to the concept, hosting the first two African-American immersion schools in the country here through as a result of various task forces tied with research studies and those theoretical frameworks that I spoke of. But yet has also had a number of African-centered schools, charter schools, independent schools, all come up, and some of them come and go over those last 20 years. And so my research is really talking about them. What's Milwaukee's relationship to this developing, growing, burgeoning theoretical framework surrounding education? So that's really the short form of it. Right now, I'm in the process of actually finding the schools, which has been way more difficult than I originally anticipated. I had a conversation with DPI, wasn't able to get a list of schools. Had a conversation with UWM, wasn't able to get the list of schools. Had a conversation with MPS, wasn't able to get the list of schools. And to me, it was almost crazy. How do you have all these schools open and under your jurisdiction, but you can't name any of them or tell me that they've been open or existent? So really, I've been trying to put together that piece to kind of get a baseline of like, where are these schools, how are they open, who founded them, who are the leaders, and then going from there to see what type of empirical studies can be done.
That's interesting. Do you think the relative lack of transparency and even disclosing that will become like part of your research?
Definitely. That first experience was like, okay, my methods section is already going to be chock full of what this experience has already set me on. A series of conversations, and I'm sure the more vocal I am about it, the more responses I'm going to get from a lot of people. I noticed a lot of, though some are very friendly in the public sector in research, a lot are very antagonistic towards students and researchers coming in. So I'm sure the more vocal that I become about the issue, the more response and more feedback to alleviate and or correct the issue I'll probably get from a lot of individuals, which you gotta do what you gotta do to get your research done.
I think it's interesting. I mean, partly since it seems like studying education seriously, has a sense of that doesn't together like happen as much as it should. I mean, and even like generally when people talk about like race and racial problems, I mean usually the issues of schools becomes really directive, like sort of glib. This is very problematic. Of course, education things we really should do more about this, but not carrying it any further necessarily. So I guess in that, what you found so far, I mean, are there like the specific structures that think are like sort of the most heavily involved with in terms of, I guess, intersection of economic and racial inequalities, or I mean, like kind of like where the terrain of this kind of issue in Milwaukee is?
Right. I think, like you said, education in and of itself already has a sort of torrid history in dealing with how it's actually been been problem solved or problem created. I think. Well, my belief and from my research is that public education has never really been solved. It's always been an issue since its inception. And in many ways, public education has been an issue of who gets educated, what are they educating for, and how much is it going to cost us. And so you get into this idea in the economics sense, is education a public good? Is education a right? Is education a privilege? And understanding those contexts in America, understanding those structures in American context really begins the depth of how deep the questions relating to the American public education system really lie. If you think about the ideas of rights and privileges, and I actually went over this with my students earlier today, that a privilege inherently by its definition is that you get something because someone else does not. That's the whole idea of a privilege. The difference, its direct opposite, being something that you get that has no bearing on anyone else getting, which is your right. And so we had that conversation in relationship to all the isms. We're talking about different forms of oppression. And so we were talking about specifically racism today, and that when we say these ideas of white privilege or male privilege, that it's tied to the fact that because you get something, someone else does not. And if we start thinking of education as a privilege, which a certain presidential candidate has mentioned that education is indeed a privilege. If we consider it a privilege, that means that some people are not entitled to actually gaining an education. However, routinely the rhetoric is that education is the rubric that we're going to use to talk about quality, to talk about ability, effectiveness. We're using that as a rubric. However, we're considering it a privilege, meaning people are excluded from the offset. And so, just like you mentioned, there's some structures that exist here in the U.S. that automatically put you at a disadvantage. Some of it gender, some of it sexuality, some of it race. But those things in those intersections create the barrier before you even have the conversation to talk about, is this quality education? Is this good education? We've already created a barrier that doesn't even give you access.
Yeah, what class are you teaching this semester?
I'm teaching actually at UW Whitewater, Intro to Social Science. So it's through the Women's Studies Department, and that is their general education course, kind of focusing on issues of diversity and the individual and society kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a lot less specialized in the course, but I guess are you finding that overlaps a bit with your research, or that you're directly drawing through, or like seeing concepts and or testing them in terms of how the students respond to them?
Yeah, I think the real important thing is being clear in definitions. I think, I teach a graduate class at UWM, which is a very different conversation. But with undergrads, these are first semester freshmen. Most of them had not, we took a little poll of the class today, most of them have not had classes, discussions, trainings on issues of diversity. So this is their welcoming introduction to it. So it's really helped me to be able to define what these terms are. And I've really always been of the school of thought that a teacher does not become a master of what they understand until they're able to break it down to the simplest of forms. And so I've really been challenged in that way, because in some words, I remember on the board, I put up a word that to me seemed like a simple word. I can't even remember what it was now, but no student in the class knew what it meant. And it was not it wasn't even a defining word. I was using it just as an action word for them to complete an assignment. And they were like, we have no idea what that means. Can you clarify? And just noting where that is and being able, let's break all of these things down to their smallest parts has been really helpful when it comes to the research process. I understand this concept. I've broken it down.
Good, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because I mean that's something I've been thinking of more and more, and even I guess I've talked about a few times the show previously. Is that I think there's a structural tendency for academics to use things that are and use a level of what's called sophisticated vocabulary or jargon-heavy vocabulary.
Yeah.
I mean that is useless in terms of day-to-day conversation. I think is useless not just because academics are sort of egghead off in the crowds, but because there's a structural tendency to encourage a very more non-direct language, non-transparent language, that language that only other academics, only people who've had a certain number of classes can understand, which is useful if you're trying to set up these kind of elaborate internal mythology and rituals that need to go through and to achieve expertise, and it's also useful for a profession that, at least I know in history, the standard for if you dissertation and you have then sunk in however many years of life into it, and then we're expecting to have it to be published to get sort of as the necessary step for tenure track job, and indeed like one of the main requirements for tenure, but also academic presses generally make like 100 copies at most, and then send it off to different libraries with no expectation of mass market and no attempt to make it affordable. So because of that, most academics don't seek their own language and style of writing to actually be reaching beyond non-academics or to be challenging. So then it becomes a convenient little insulated bubble by which even if things that are extremely critical of society's conventions as a whole, if they're critical in sort of elaborate academic Marxist terminology of it becomes neutralized very easy.
Right. I mean, academia in and of itself is intimidating. I mean, it's intimidating because a true scholar knows another true scholar and will dismiss anyone who pretends to be a scholar. That's the nature of academia, and it's a fine line because what it is, I mean, what we're describing is the elitism of our higher education system. It's not made for everyone to know or have access. It's made for a certain sector of people to have access, and we think of it less of elitism, but more as initiation. We are now initiated because we've gone through a process to now interact and to speak like this and to use these kind of terms instead of actually talking about where can we actually do the application. And that's kind of what my paper that I presented last year kind of got to, the idea of scholar activism and the fact that there's a responsibility, at least in my belief, and not every researcher believes this, there's a responsibility that we do our research, and we do what fulfills our job requirements in our initiated club of higher education, but we have a responsibility to then take that stuff apart, and then this is how it applies into the real world. We don't have to be the keepers of knowledge, especially in this age when everybody has access. We don't have to isolate the knowledge from the masses when we can actually parcel it out in correct ways, because considering technology these days, people can parcel it out in incorrect ways very easily, and so your research has the opportunity to correct some wrongs in lots of ways.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that there's a obligation, to use the insights and even more. If we see that can use education to make critiques of society and see underlying structural problems, but to go forward and actually do things that matter to try to dislodge it, to try to actually dispute the problems and power abuse that we see routinely. But I don't know. I think that is also not everyone in the department necessarily shares that feeling. I think there are. Again, the structural reasons that come to it because for all the sophistication or accomplishment of doing it. I wonder in parts if it doesn't become similar to like elaborate hazing ritual in terms of needing to go through a certain number of classes and write a certain number of précis and do the necessary coursework and produce the academic content that will then lend themselves to be accepted by the inner core, by the sort of gatekeepers.
The gatekeepers. It is interesting because even if we look at it in those ways, we can talk about the same structural issues that are in our public education system are right at the root of why the system becomes more than just the club. It becomes a kind of symbol of class stratification of who has access to this knowledge, for what reasons, why, and how can they use it. It mirrors it in many ways, but then you can draw the direct parallel of why it exists at that level as well. If it begins in kindergarten, of course, we're going to have the residual effects at the doctoral level.
Agreed. So in that context, I mean, maybe expanding more on like the barriers of or ways that current college system and college forms of education helps perpetuate these systems. I mean, whether consciously and perhaps or somewhat less consciously. I mean, like in the context of Milwaukee, I mean, where are the kind of chief or like most consistent, most recurrent failings?
In higher education or in public education?
Sort of both, but kind of a higher education or some of connection to.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've discovered, and I think I'm okay with saying this. One thing that I've discovered is the UWM students, faculty, and administrators not taking as much advantage of being able to really connect with the community, really thoroughly connect with the community. The relationship, as everyone has probably realized, about the area immediately around UWM and the River West area is one thing because you have just where the students are living. But actual integration into the city. I mean, you can think of it in a political way, as in you guys are residents. You guys, as in students of UWM, administrators, you are residents for the time being, whether it's temporary or not. So you should be able to have some sort of voice on what is happening to the area, especially in things that affect your institution of learning. You can think about it economically. If you're here at the institution, you are clearly paying taxes somewhere in the local area about how things are going on in your city and what you can do to make the city better. You can actually talk about integration into the political economy, either by representation or by talking about the businesses in the area and things like that. That's really been where I've seen like the big consistent failure, even in terms of connecting directly with the public education system. There's abilities and to do such things as College for Kids and other things like that, but the ability to actually integrate so deeply that no one sees a separation between our public education system and our public system of higher education. They can see a direct path. I think those are opportunities, I won't call them just failures, but opportunities that the students, administrators, and faculty can really latch onto to do something more to strengthen that relationship and actually make the institution accessible, integrated, and of the city, not just in the city.
Yeah, and it's striking as well because there's been so much talk and so much of the buzzwords being used about them from the chancellor on down in terms of community engagement and developing, but it means corporate community in a sense. It means it means creating bridges and connections of it with people for opportunities of investment and try to get more wealthy donors on board, and it has very little with even looking out and range of it. I think you mentioned like sort of like with the River West is one thing, which I mean it's a sort of tangential, but you have noticed and seen, I think, becoming in some ways problematic, some like tendency to like try to build up River West identity, River West brand. That was something that in one of the night school classes at the public house I was talking about, like, it seemed like as a response to like failure to recall and sort of dismal political situation to like focus on sort of growing own food and becoming self-sufficient, becoming more involved, and becoming a strong sense of a culture or counterculture, and or even just River West is this sort of like rad, cool area with so many co-ops live in, which has advantages, but also is leaving out a large portion of Milwaukee.
River West isn't the North Side.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it's also not representative of the entire city because you have a transient population very different than the population on the North Side that are students that are coming here to study and then moving to other parts of the city, or coming here to study to solely participate in the activities with the university in the Mid area and then leaving the area. And so that makes it very different, and it's not full integration. You're kind of making the university in and of itself just a place for the transient and not for the actual community.
So yeah, also in terms of within your research, I mean,
Yeah.
are there other ways that I would imagine becomes a lot of similarity in structures between Milwaukee and other highly segregated cities? I mean, what are there other things that become unique to Milwaukee, particularly in terms of the history, the timeline, overall demographics, the role of education, the role of regarding education?
I think what's real interesting is Milwaukee's civil rights history. It's a lot of interesting books that have been written on Milwaukee civil rights history, and one of which that really details the issues regarding education is the Selma of the North, which really recontextualizes what has actually been the civil rights movement. It's been put in the context of what happened in the South, the struggles of the South, people going from the North down to the South to have these conversations. Instead of saying, no, this was an issue that was nationwide, it just played out differently, depending on the context. And I think Milwaukee has a unique history, which I really like in that book, Some of the North, that really talks about space and the negotiation of space being paramount to understanding how privilege and power really worked in the city. So you have, you have conversations relating to who had rights to the space. So you have the housing segregation, which is very deep in the city, and as everyone knows, Milwaukee remains a segregated city. So that has a large impact on what public education became, because education, schooling, neighborhood schools were all predicated upon who lived in the area. And so you have the 220 program and all of these things that were built to address the 1954 Brown decision. Yet, to this day, in 2012, we're still having conversations about this. How do we address this idea of desegregation? What does it actually mean? For what purposes does it serve? The findings that were made in that decision are still up for debate. So it's an issue that's never actually been solved. And in fact, you end up with a system, you have the city of Milwaukee having a high percentage of African American students in the public school system that does not mirror the population of the city. And so you talk about how that actually impacts what the public education system is, who negotiates it, what its importance is, who's able to come in and have opinions about it, how it's ran through in politics, who has the purview to talk about it in ways that actually addresses the issues at hand, provides answers and resources, are really tied to all of these historical things. Racism that's been played out economically, in housing, in various areas. It's an excellent point that you make, that historical context can't be ignored if we're going to talk about what the status of education is today. It's the impetus. We have to discuss it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems also, although you obviously have to discuss it, although it seems unfortunately often in the context of education rights and education focus, sometimes unfortunately, community can go on quite well without having talking about it. I mean, even thinking over in the context of the of the last several years and some of the increased attention and rhetoric on defending education and defending public schools and defending the idea of public education, and create and circling around to provide a strong reinforcement for that. It's more of a it becomes seen in deeply uneven ways in terms of, I think, but especially the way that the defense of the teachers in Wisconsin back in 2011 ended up becoming very much involved with associated with defense of the middle class. That the two were sort of conflated. That education and the ability to provide services and for education was linked to the kind of the rearguard action for the middle class and for kind of preventing our standards from being undermined.
Mm-hmm. And that brings me back right to the paper that I submitted to the conference last year that was directly tied to class mobility, and how the inability for the public education system, though purported and using the rhetoric as the tool for class mobility, yet there's all these things that prevent people from actually using it. And the one that I analyzed in that particular thing was the school to prison pipeline. But I talk about it I called it the anti-class mobility triumvirate, which was the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, and the nonprofit industrial complex, and how those three institutions work using these oppressions that we talk about, racism, classism, to actually ensure in many ways that class mobility is not possible. And in many ways, it becomes a way to substantiate in some regards the idea of the mythical middle class because you think you're in there, but it's all these constructs that will ever let you actually enter or even go beyond because of these things that you could never actually control that provide beyond your purview.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess in line with that, I mean, wonder maybe could expand a little in terms of the studying, in terms of the own forming their dissertation work. I mean, within urban studies department of it. I mean, I'm most familiar within history, so maybe provide a little bit more in terms of how you think the department operates as a whole. I mean, advantages or structural problems in that, or even just I guess how typical this kind of work and the kind of outlook are bringing into it is of other graduate students.
Well, one of the things that I'm most critical of in the urban education department is the idea of urban education. What is it? What do you mean? And why are you getting a degree in it? Why isn't there a parallel suburban education or rural education program at this university? What is the intent of having such thing as an urban education? And so oftentimes when we have this discussion in class, the reality is people come to an urban education program because they see so many problems with the population in urban areas. And so it's little work in our particular department really tied to the administrative side, but really about all the problems. And these problems are seen have yet to talk about in class, and this is just from my limited experience, have yet for individuals to focus on what are the constructs that have created what we call urban and why do we have such thing as an urban education program. Instead, it's the assumption that we say urban when we mean black, or we say urban and we mean Latino, or we say urban and we mean poor. And instead of discussing those things, instead of discussing the poor, instead of discussing poverty, instead of discussing the economic system that is directly linked to education, we talk about these. Instead of the root of the problem, we talk about the leaves of the problem. We talk about the kids who ultimately are victims of it, but we blame them, and they become the problem. So then it becomes, how do we fix the kids? Because the kids are the big problem without ever addressing the institution. And to even think about it as closely or as clearly of saying this degree that you're paying for codifies the existence of these structural things, in particular language. And so I think the graduate students in the program have an opportunity, one, to dispel what that is. Let's recreate what this whole notion of urban, what do we mean by it? And when we say it, be clear, be direct, and not use it as a euphemism for something else. If we're talking about poor students, let's talk about poor students. Talking about the homeless population, let's talk about the homeless population. But let's talk about them based upon the constructs that create them, not just them as the problem, because that victim blaming puts you in the circle, that cycle of just allowing things to continue to manifest without ever actually addressing the issues at hand.
Yeah, and I mean, which seemed to touch, it's not an area I study as much directly, but I mean, the formation of the urban space, something to be contained, something that's sort of out there that's, whether it's inherently threatening or inherently potentially threatening, or it's, the state of, or the city is a state of moral collapse, or the city is a state of, in terms of the, demographic threats. I mean, the sort of coded way to allow people to say all the things that, it's more awkward for them to be saying directly. I mean,
in many ways, it's kind of like the purgatory of jail, because you have the suburban and rural spaces, which are supposed to be the protected spaces. Then you have the city, which is like the place where you negotiate. Are you good enough to move out to the suburban or rural area, or are you going to be pushed deeper into the city, the inner city? So it's like this abyss that you go into, which you then are funneled into the criminal justice system, into the prison. So it's like this protected cyclical view of what our spaces actually are. And so that idea of negotiation of space, whether it's political space, physical space, intellectual space that's always been at the root, especially here in Milwaukee, of where the issue lies. Who's allowed to be in this space? Who's allowed to run this space, manage this space, call this space for what it is, and for what reasons can they use this space for? Whether it's actual physical space, which we can see directly in Milwaukee, the idea of the housing patterns, the segregation, the concept of inner city, or is it the intellectual space? Who's allowed to talk in the school system? Who's allowed to run the school system? What knowledge are we able to put into them? Or is it the political space? Are we going to redistrict like they've done recently? Are we going to redistrict to make sure that certain people can control certain areas politically? It's forever a negotiation based upon these oppressions of race, class, and gender and sexuality that have been negotiated in terms of how space is actually going to be used in the city.
Yeah, it seems that it's disconcerting how well the model you describe of in terms of heaven and purgatory, the space of it, actually seems that applies in terms of what people are doing it. And it seems to get that. That it's needs in some cases a recognition of much more wide sweeping problems than just we have funding shortfall. That's a major component of it. But it's also recognizing that the whole pattern of privilege and prioritization of intellectual space that we've had of it is predicated on exclusion. It goes into perhaps the idea that we think of higher education, academia as being inherently elitist, that it has inherently standards, but because we're not recognizing that education at all levels of doing it is designed to be to be elite and not elite, to have the privileged and favored and better track rules, and then whereas for what we'll define them as everyone else, or for the or underprivileged or underperforming areas, without being as explicit that has a fairly clear racial not just results from this, but also intentions.
And then it's also, we talk about this with the students, but the fact that because of higher education is this closed off space, it can then go and create the rules because they're in negotiation with the other closed off spaces that create the rules. So you can have the ability. I talked about with my students about the eugenics movement and the whole idea. I was getting them to understand social science research, and just because we call something a research study doesn't mean that it's the be all end all. It's the opportunity for us to kind of think a little deeper and be critical of it. Allows us to actually exercise our mental faculties into ways that aren't limiting and aren't just a part of the status quo. So looking at it in those ways of being able to break down what those concepts are. I always think about what historian John Henrik Clarke and Theophile Obenga have brought up, talking about ancient Kemet and about the idea of the I took a visit. I did an ancient Egyptian study tour, so I visited the temples and had a chance to study the glyphs and really talk about what these words mean. And my professor was talking about the idea of we're aware of the existence of slavery in ancient Egypt and what it means. But the slaves in ancient Egypt, or the enslaved population of ancient Egypt, were often the ones who were building the temples and the pyramids. But every temple or pyramid that you see is crafted with hieroglyphs. And hieroglyphs aren't pictures, they are words, no different than me and you writing our dissertation on a brick wall. And that being said, he always goes back to the idea that these people who were enslaved were able to write on the walls, because the idea of being literate in the language wasn't an elitist thing. That was productive for the society. And so we think about how different our current context is, where this whole idea of literacy for everyone is something that's rhetoric, but rarely ever the actual tangible action. Let's have everyone literally be able to read and understand the same thing, and that's a two-way street. I need to be able to teach you how to read something, and I need to be able to break it down to you on your level, in essence, to be able to build everybody up. But if you look at the systems, then, and we're not, this isn't making romanticizing ancient Kemet, because we are talking about enslaved populations, but the enslaved population being able to still be literate, not just literate functionally, but literate and productive. and that's very different considering what our system here is in today. You talk about graduation rates in Milwaukee, I think for black males is around 45%. And that's, to me, that was shocking to believe that you have black males in the city and not even half of them will graduate high school. And we know at this day and age, high school isn't what it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years, high school barely lets you get a job at McDonald's. So we're talking about 45% of the population only being eligible for that. So what does that actually mean, the value being placed on giving people access to that?
Yeah, so it seems that simultaneously the increasing of the standards of that people, more people going for college degrees just as a need for entry-level requirements, and also more people going even for graduate degrees as needed for certain types of jobs and the requirements, so that it makes, it pushes that line of it forward, but at the same time, things that, in terms of seen as, even more central, even more basic, coming cut and, and under-resourced more and more. In a sense, and none of that becomes new, but it seems to at least suggest that the overall lines of what these policies exist for are become more and more clear. And similarly with connection to eugenics, which I've talked about in some classes before. Usually it's a matter of making people see not just not just the connection to not just Nazi Germany, that it's widespread, that it's extensive, but it's also related that it connects into within daily life, and that it's easy to look at and condemn now that no one, that no one that matters in society is saying is endorsing it in that aspect. But the challenge is recognizing the equivalents that happen now, and also actually speaking to this issue of it, we have a sort of caller or like walk-in caller of it that indicated wanted something to say on show. Here, I can just give you my. Here, maybe just.
Well, y'all was talking about education. I get on the bus, get people the registration, the vote, and plus I got this little card to help public transportation, because they trying to stop the publication. If you take the city bus, they're trying to stop it till 6 p.m., you know what I mean? And we trying to fight for that, you know what I mean? For people that go to school, because it's a card. It got education, taxes, all on there. My name is Sleepy. I got a show here too, but I just want to be a walk-in guest and speak my mind on this issue. You know what I'm saying? That's all it. I could have talked about it on my show, but I wanted to do it on somebody else's show because it got to do with higher education. Because my card got... Let me read my card off here.
Oh, sure. Go for it.
They got job economy, healthcare, high taxes, public safety, public education, especially with the public transportation. And they both is the same because college students, they take the bus, some of them. You know what I'm saying? So we want y'all to fill out cards or whatever and vote for everything on it. Because I take the city bus and register people, all that. So, y'all got anything to say?
No, I think that certainly connecting, not just the education in the schools itself, but how the accessing them of who's permitted, what spaces, are framed as being, actually accessible to everyone, or which ones are only sort of in theory open to everyone. In theory, we're past the point in society where we're going to be saying, in terms of no colors allowed, that we're not going to be that level of overt racism, but might have the same effect just by making transportation costs unaffordable to again certain people. So I agree absolutely. It becomes a way to have all the ugliest, most dysfunctional aspects of it, but just in a way that's a little less obvious about what it's being done. So that white liberals can sort of sit back and say well, there's problems remain, but look how far we've come.
Right. I think that also speaking to exactly what Sleepy was talking about, I think that becomes the next step. And I talked about the idea of scholar activism being so important to me, because I don't do research merely for the sake of research or to publish. I do research because I identify the problem, propose solutions, and therefore can go act on it. And so I think the next step in many of these cases, once we identify the problem, all these issues relating to the various oppressions within the public education system, becomes the organizing component. What is the organizing around these particular issues, and what is the organizing for? What is the goal of the organizing? What strategies and tactics are employed? What type of leadership system is created? What kind of institutions are built that actually lead to bridging the gap between campus and community, scholar and activist, educated and inexperienced, the working class and the educated class. Being able to meld those is being able to say, we can study here, you work here, but we can come together because organizing can happen to address these issues at hand.
And even more in terms of seeing what the priority is of this. I mean, you could compare, like, in the River West context, the response by other organization groups, if it's like the fire at the Josie's Art Gallery, which people very rapidly coalescing community things, and then the response, I mean, from the release of the video for Derek Williams' death that showed pretty clearly police murder involved, which, I mean, there was a response in both cases. There were people that were upset and were attempting to assist, but, I mean, smaller overall numbers, and again, even among the more self-styled, militants, I mean, it's a sense of momentum dissipating, and it becomes like, oh, yes, this is a terrible, terrible thing, but it's not necessarily something that in terms of people, I mean, from neighborhood where we're sitting now and broadcasting from, are necessarily going to go that far out of their way. And it's not something that I guess certainly see like scholarly community at UW-Milwaukee, as a whole, taking a firm major collective stand.
Right, which is the opportunity at hand.
Yeah.
That is the opportunity specifically at hand. I think the greatest parallel to really take is to talk about the River West area in terms of community. Let's talk about it in terms of community, and then talk about the other parts of the city. Not in comparison to say, look what this community is doing and look at what you're not, but look at talking about the concept of community and then how it relates to the potential for organizing and then to actually get things done. River West leverages a lot of power in the area as a community. You think about the institutions that have been built in the River West community. You have co-ops, you have the building that we're in now. You have a lot of institutionalized places that reflect the community's needs, values, wants, and how they choose to construct that. The opportunity that the other parts of the city can actually do are related directly to that. Being able to organize themselves in ways that are actually productive into local institution building, and those institutions go beyond physical spaces. They go into all the other spatial constructs that we talked about, politically, intellectually, and things like that. And so I'll take this moment to plug a little bit of my organizing work. I work really closely with a great group of people, UWM students, that have UWM students and community members, definitely taking the opportunity to bridge that gap, to work on an organizing effort called All Black Everything. And the purpose of All Black Everything is to work on liberation efforts of the Black community. And that's empowering us to talk about and understand and live Black power, Black culture, Black life, and Black unity, and to really look at it in ways that are critical to us actually building what is community for the sake not just of organizing, but to effectively change, to actually make things better. And you see examples of it actually happening all across the city, but let's talk about how we can actually do what a community does, which is leverage that power. Being able to say, this is what we want, this is how we want it, and this is how it's going to be, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable to what these standards are. And so I've been working with All Black Everything. I founded it with Ian Biddle, former county supervisor, and we worked really closely on creating an organization that's more than an organization, that's definitely working on those community standards and talking about how do we do, in many ways, not trying to mimic, but giving you an example, how do we do what River West has been able to do? How have you been able to leverage so much power that I can stand here on East Center Street and talk about River West things? These institutions aren't even considered Milwaukee things, they're considered River West, property of River West, the community of River West. From every corner, you'll see things that are unique and special to the River West community. How can other areas of the city function in the same way for their own power? Because if they're not doing that, they're not functioning using their own power politically, educationally, intellectually, economically, that means someone is using them. And if someone is using them, then they become products of what we see on the north side of Milwaukee, which is very different than over here. And it's not about ability, capability, or resources. They are there. They are there. And it's not a measure of, look what they've been able to do and we can't. It's not that at all. It's being able to say, no, we can take charge of our community despite it being taken charge of on our behalf by other people. It's just that being able to build what that power structure is so that we can build those institutions such as, very simple as such as a video store, a radio station, a school, a library. All of those things are possible, but that's where the organizing component comes in. And so you have the students at the UWM community. So you have Cammie Thomas, Melissa Martha, Charmaine Lang, and a number of other students who are saying, you know what, we're here. And none of them Milwaukee residents, but have taken a vested interest in saying, how can we make the Milwaukee community better? Because not only am I in it, I am of it. And so bridging that gap, that means nothing. So what if we're at the university? It means nothing because we have a community that we're responsible for, and there's no barrier between us.
Good. Yeah, I think yes, it's probably an interesting way to think about it. Although I guess the one point it might other just caution in terms of run through it like limitations of counterculture, of the River West cultural brand of it is in some cases it leads itself to tangible achievements, but other cases can be sort of co-opted or negated somewhat. I mean, I'm thinking not to name names too much, but probably thinking or Nick Kovacs as the alumni who becomes identified with River West community.
Right.
I mean, I think he also has a station here actually that contributes to, but also is the person who is alderman will say, as he did last January, that racial discrimination by Milwaukee police. No, that
Right.
Clearly that can't be something that's going on here.
Right.
So again, I mean, there's always tends to be tendencies to, deflate it as much as it can, and it seems that the lines of where formal politics begin and where our elected officials begin is precisely where are often the most vulnerable to taking on aspects of that brand or sort of that identity, but not translating that into actual substance and in their actual decisions and regular statements being much more limited in how different they are from every other politician.
Right. And so what that ultimately means is there's work to be done.
Yeah.
There's definitely work to be done. It's really, I use it less as the motto and where we should strive for, but more as an example of it actually happens. It is definitely possible, but you can always point out there's an opportunity for us to even do better or to even increase the amount of power and leverage and all politically, economically, educationally that we actually do have and that we actually can utilize. You look at, I know originally we're talking about black nationalism, but you look at, there's been communities across the U.S. of black nationalists in a maroonage type move, saying we're operating in this fashion, economically, politically, and educationally, which is the ultimate stance in many ways. I mean, River West isn't trying to secede, but I mean, in many ways, in order to make that stance of how strong we believe not only what we're doing, but how against we are what's doing, is actually making that stance. We're going to secede. We're going to do the maroon effort and saying we're no longer operating within your system.
Yeah, and that seems that in part can be useful. I mean, not even in the question of does it succeed or is it directly viable? Well, I mean, of course, sometimes it's not becomes viable. It becomes ambitious one of it, but there's also an ambitious way to state the degree of the problem is to say that that if it is an issue of structures as a whole, and structures that in many cases are starting to go back decades or that have existed for as long and longer than this country itself, means that it's it can be easily contested or solved easily. I mean, I think often it seems the issue with academics or with organizers and organizations is too much. It's either a tendency to set fairly limited things of what they're actually asking for, what they're actually attempting to change or alter.
Just a quick shout out to Brother Sleepy who was here. It's his birthday today. Happy birthday. Enjoy your day.
My party's at the Uptowner. My 40th birthday. If y'all know where that's at, that's on East Center Street on Humboldt. Come enjoy Sleepy 40th birthday party. I'm out of here. This is a great show. I'm going to call, come in, and give them ratings.
Awesome. All right, look forward to it.
Enjoy your birthday.
Happy birthday.
I did that to everybody that do this show.
Shout out.
Thank you.
Just myself.
That's what's
I
up.
got a radio show myself.
Oh, that's what's up. That's what's up.
You need to come y'all both need to come on my show.
Definitely.
Thursday, I got a show at 7 p.m.
Cool.
But I think the points that you raised are important for consideration.
A little closer.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The points that you raise are really important for consideration, especially when we're going to talk about the responsibility of the scholar in a sort of integrated community. It's a article on the School to Prison Pipeline written, I believe her name is Erica Miner, and she's talking about the reflexivity of herself as a researcher, understanding the school to prison pipeline. She has gone on and done such research on the school to prison pipeline, talking about all these juveniles who have are now a part of the criminal justice system. And she took a step back and said, but this is their reality. You know, I can publish these papers and go home and work for my university job, but this doesn't stop this from happening. This is happening. It's convenient for a researcher to say, well, I have this population in this area and this phenomena, blah, blah, blah. But the responsibility of the activist is not just only to act on it, but then also be responsible to the community for the issues at hand. So it's one thing to discover the phenomena, say it's a problem, and then propose a solution. But it's another thing when the community says, hey, this is going on, we need your help. And so that's why I really appreciate the way she frames that, because the scholar activism isn't a hierarchical or elitist or imposition. It's not, I've done this research and now I'm going to put this on your community. It's, I am, like I'm said, not just in the community, but of the community. So as I propose, there's feedback. There's feedback, this works, this doesn't work. But at the same time, it's also a proposal from the community. This is the issue at hand. This is my reality.
Sure, yeah.
How can we do something about it? And use your whatever ties you have in the scholarly realm, which often links in many ways, like we've discussed, directly to the policy realm, to address this particular issue. And that's really the heart of what All Black Everything actually tries to do. The responsibility of the scholar and the activist to not operate as just a member of the community, not just someone who resides in the community, but who is actually actively making the community, improving the community, developing the community.
Yeah, I think it's a good setup of it to have. I mean, since it seems that the duties is the first thing that activists should be aware and trying to do is the same thing that teachers everywhere should be doing. It's like understanding the space that they're operating in, understanding the possibilities of it, the constraints. I mean, more than anything else, also understanding the audience. I mean, I think that's sometimes problem. I mean, with some of these like self-imposed limitations by activists collectively is doing things that aren't particularly effective, that don't reach terribly many people, that end up speaking, more to themselves, but also means that should be aware of who the audience is, who's immediately going to be impacted by whatever are saying or doing, and also who isn't. I mean, who is beyond the audience and what possible reasons for. Which means then that if it's if it's a rally or meeting or any kind of political discussion, in terms of sort of Milwaukee, and it's overwhelmingly Caucasian or exclusively Caucasian, then there's probably an issue there. It's not, I mean, different types of structures involved with it, but and it's not, to some extent, not always directly perpetuated by the organization itself, but they are still being perpetuated or being accepted at least. So I don't know. I guess feel like biggest thing I've come to feel more and more of it is that sort of recognizing this, but not just doing the kind of yes, and that's terrible, and then just continuing on without actually changing behavior, but I mean, realizing that this sort of thing is happening and there's not any kind of like magic immunity or cards, that be just declaring itself an activist group or just declaring herself as part of the professors or part of the intelligentsia doesn't negate that. You're still being defined by it. You're still, in many cases, unfortunately, they're still reinforcing it.
Right. So I mean, even if you drive that Benz, you're still who you are. And I think you bring up a good point about mirroring the responsibility of the activist and the organizer to the responsibility of the teacher. And I think I worked in professional development in the state of Delaware for educators for 2 years, and one of the key concepts that I readily apply to my organizing work is that of differentiated instruction. And the concept of differentiated instruction is in a class, in any given classroom, you have a variety of learners, not just in terms of these are the kinesthetic, these are the audio, these are the tactile, not just that, but the fact that you have people who just learn in their own particular way. And if that's the case, then the teacher's responsibility in full awareness and knowledge and cognizance of what that is, they still have the information that they need to get these children to know. So they have to use their content mastery, their responsibility to their knowledge that they're teaching to differentiate so those different students can have access to it. And I think well, I believe, not just I think, I believe that the responsibility of the activists and the organizers to operate in the same tenet. You're not only tied to those who hear you.
Right.
You are tied directly to the entire community of concern. And if the entire community of concern isn't hearing you, then what do you need to do differently to make sure that they do hear you? And that's been the constant struggle that working with All Black Everything, that's been the constant struggle that I consider on the daily basis. We have these community concerns. We can agree on them because everybody espouses them at any given moment in barbershops, in grocery stores, around the kitchen table. So we know that they are there. But are we organizing together collectively around them? What segments are we reaching? What segments are we not? What segments are hearing me? What segments are not? What segments are disagreeing for what reasons? And how can we address those issues? I think the responsibility of the teacher not only parallels, but is exactly the same as the responsibility of the activist and organizer in the community. And therefore, is greatly the responsibility of the scholar activist. The scholar has to, in my view, and I know that this is not the general view of most in academia, as we mentioned before, is that the scholar has the responsibility to be able to share that knowledge, disseminate that knowledge, and activate that knowledge for the community.
True. Agreed. Yeah, and I think that, I mean, partly the counter, one of the arguments, at least within our own profession, our own department, have seen in terms of people who are very much not considering themselves as activists, or the faculty member who, in orientation for new grad students, suggested that however much we might feel at some level should leaving activism at the door and just trying to be sort of as kind of more neutral, neutral, objective, giving the students tools to make their own decisions, etc. Is I don't know. I mean, partly I think it can be very, very convenient to overestimate how effective that type of or even as commitment to academic neutrality is in the long run. The idea that we don't, in terms of, rather than putting our own views as much of it, that simply teach us sort of more of a distance and provide other given context, and then allow sort of introduce sort of critiques of other systems that students will over the long run lead them to become more empowered, run through. I mean, it comes as a kind of appealing strategy. I mean, partly because it's just how it seems conceptually, but also because it doesn't actually ask that much.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Because it's lazy. No.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's non-challenging.
It's non-challenging.
It's something that there exist degrees for, and things, and structures and conferences and politics and a lot to reinforce it. So
very insular, very individualistic, which is fine. That mirrors what our society is. It's predicated upon that individual notion of what I do, and rarely is it reported as a responsibility to the community. And I think that's a really great point to bring up, that idea that that's the battle. That's the battle in academia, those who feel this way versus those who really feel passionate about the activism.
And I think partly, I mean, it should be a matter of recognizing that yes, we can be a voice, and there can be times when in classroom, whether at any level of it, including at the college level of it, putting in this other kind of view or this different interpretation of history and contemporary society could, actually change people's students' minds and lead them to be more engaged, more to changing themselves. But in many other cases, it doesn't. I mean, because honestly, I mean, higher education also becomes a matter of a commodity, a matter of a degree that because people are doing it largely for sort of to be able to have better job elsewhere. So fairly rationally, they're not going to invest that much time or attention and focus on it beyond what's required, wherever the standard of the grade that they're trying to do, and whatever the in terms of and the course that comes afterwards. So that I wouldn't inherently expect, no matter even among the most brilliant, most charismatic, most well prepared of instructors, I wouldn't be inherently confident that 2 years down the road they're going to necessarily retain much of the class, or that they're going to be extreme, that they're going to that's going to simply transform them into activists in themselves. That I don't think the idea of that of neutral, objective education that will allow other people to become more empowered is kind of a cheat, but it's convenient to bribe into. I mean, in some senses, again, and the other argument is that it's actually worse so is effective. I think that would be, if education were, higher education were such a sort of battleground that we could so easily impact and cause a massive beneficial impact, it would be regulated and repressed a lot more. I mean, the fact in some cases that the right, by and large, I mean, with certain exceptions, and likewise, it's no coincidence that Arizona defunded ethnic studies department at the same time doing everything else. But the fact that I think that history as a whole isn't closer scrutinized ideological content indicates that I think some other people know fairly well that it's not as relevant as it thinks it is. So that I don't, in some cases, never using the justification or that kind of excuse of like the transforming of young minds as a reason to limit what we do. I think that, it's that's part of I think ongoing debates of having.
Definitely, and I mean, I think of it in two ways. One, it's like a false sense of security that you get to have by saying it's okay that if I claim, and I say, I mean, this is espousing my own ontological and epistemological views on research, but to claim this objectivity or this neutrality allows you to feel secure in what's happening, and though it gives room for others to be critical, if you don't teach them how to be critical, then you're giving them knowledge. But then it also ties back to what the role higher education has played previously in these activist movements. You can look throughout the world where a lot of these activist movements, these big revolutionary changes, were directly out of higher education. You had students who felt certain ways, and I'm not saying that it was a type of elitism. It was probably more of the culture where they were able to explore. You can think about the Black Power movement. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale were in college, and they were like, whoa, what this is. You can look at the French Revolution and how those were groups of students, and that ability to say that environment nurtures, but also the ability to connect leads to say, well, this is why it's also repressed in many ways.
Agreed, and I think that the like going beyond that between like colleges as areas where different and more challenging ideas can circulate, but actually making that more than the usual kind of like small activist intellectual bubble. I mean, it seems like it always needs to include the willingness to recognize that political change is needs disruption of business as usual, that needs in terms of the shutdown of regular operations, including regular operations of schools as a vehicle for drive for more spreading of the ideas beyond them.
Right.
Okay, so I think we're at time. Any closing statements or thoughts, Mike?
Of course. Definitely. Thank you again for the opportunity to come to speak. This has been great conversation and just an excellent opportunity. I will talk about very briefly that the opportunity I've been afforded at UWM to develop these kind of thoughts has been great. It's been absolutely great, especially to not have done any of my college education in the city, even though being from here, to come back and realize that there's opportunities to really use a lot of the tools that I've gained here in my hometown has been a great opportunity. I will lastly plug All Black Everything. We have so many upcoming events for people to get involved in. You can check us out on Facebook. It's Facebook /THEABEMOVEMENT, the ABE movement. You can track our 3 programs, Feed the People, which talks about food justice in our communities. We've been working very closely with River West Co-op and the Public House and really developing what that looks like beyond the River West area. Sankofa Study Circle, where we actually have discussions like this, which is happening right now, and as soon as I leave, I'm going to participate. Happens the 2nd and 4th Tuesday at Urban Underground, 4850 West Fond du Lac Avenue. And then we also have the Buy Black program, which talks about building up economics in the Black community throughout the city. So if you check out our Facebook page, you'll get links to all that, contact information, how you can get involved, where we meet, and all of that. So I definitely encourage those who are about bridging the gap between the intellectual and the activists to come out and join us.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as final point of it, I'll mention that at the beginning that Monique and I had met when we was doing the last February, the ASGS organized the labor and working class consciousness conference, which we're going to be doing again in this coming February. So February 15th to 16th, 2013. Stay tuned. It's organized by both ASGS and BGSA. As part of it, hopefully can deliver more interesting content, interesting just ideas and pessimistic interpretations of the past and present conditions.
Right.
All right. So thank you very much. Until next week, this has been Size of Thoughts.